This letter was written by one of the half-brothers of Jesus, James, who would become the leader of the church in Jerusalem after Jesus' death and resurrection. He was well respected for his advice and the wisdom that he had for the believing communities. And at one point, he decided to write down his best teachings and send them to other Jewish followers of Jesus who were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. And what he wrote to them has become known as the Book of James. And as far as the dates for when this book could have been written, there's a couple dates to consider. The first one's early AD 49, and the other one is closer to his death, which would have been around AD 62. Now, James seems to be writing this to early Jewish Jesus followers. Now, they're away from Jerusalem and probably out of Palestine. And a big clue is his reference to the 12 tribes that are scattered throughout the world. And although James does have a Jewish flavor, we know it's addressed to a Christian audience. He uses terms like brother and Lord over and over. Also, there's this obvious lack of gospel explanation, assuming that these are mostly believers already, following the way of Jesus. His audience could largely be Christian Jews, which seems to be most likely. Again, because this has this Jewish flavor, James was the leader in the Jerusalem church, but he's writing to help them live the life they were created to live and not settle for empty religion. He often uses Old Testament truths, but he repositions them in some of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount teachings, like a lot. It's like he takes the life of Jesus and shows you how it's applied practically. And out of the 108 verses, 54 of them are imperatives or really important instructions. So half of this letter is showing us the how-to part of following Jesus. And it's so Jesus-focused. James uses allusions to Jesus' words found in the Gospels more than any other New Testament book. And you'll notice he's got a conversational style, this short, expressive sayings and the interweaving of themes that all make this book kind of similar to wisdom writings like you see in Proverbs. But it's primarily showing us how to live like Jesus today. James concentrates on questions of everyday life. He considers practical issues like concern for the poor, how to steward wealth, controlling your tongue and speaking life and pursuing unity with everything you have, living a pure life. He talks about patience and endurance during difficult times. He really shows us what it looks like to practice the way of Jesus. In James 2:26, it tells us faith without works is dead. And that has a tendency to trip up a lot of people. I've even heard people interpret it as saying, you have to do good things to be righteous. But that's actually backwards. That statement's all about believing you already are who God says you are. And that leads us to do those good works that God has prepared for us to walk in. And that's why you see so much about prayer and faith and how those two work together. This wisdom book is so valuable to living fully alive in Jesus right now, just as much as when James first shared it centuries ago. And the thing that's wild about this book, James wasn't even a believer until after the resurrection. He grew up with Jesus as a half-brother and rejected everything he ever said until one day when it finally all made sense. See, Jesus appeared to James personally after the resurrection. And for the first time in his life, his eyes were open and he actually believed in Jesus as the Messiah. And he would go from the most unbelieving to the leader of believers. So much that he's referred to by the Apostle Paul as a pillar in the early church. And I think that's why you sense so much passion in his letter. Remember, during this time, there was a lot of injustice, corruption, and poverty under the turmoil of Roman rule. And because of this, there was a lot of persecution, pagan beliefs, and a lot of physical needs. So what James tackles in his book is very much what it looks like to follow Jesus in the midst of a crazy world. He talks about how to actually walk the narrow road that leads to life. It's almost like everything he ignored about Jesus before the resurrection just came into hyper focus and urgency about the way we should now live our lives. It was a difficult time, but it was an exciting time as it was right after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the coming of the Holy Spirit, the birth of the early church, the original movement of hope. So welcome to the book of James.